Benny Bennett sat alone in a quiet corner booth at Rosie's Café, the only diner still operating on Main Street. Morning sunlight filtered through dust-flecked windows, illuminating the steam rising from his chipped ceramic mug. Black coffee. No cream, no sugar. Just like always. He turned a page of the local paper, the ink smudging faintly on his fingertips. The world outside may have changed, but Benny liked his routine untouched. He wore a brown wool coat over a faded U.S. Army sweatshirt, sleeves tugged down to cover the scars that lined his forearms. Locals knew him as a quiet man who kept to himself, polite nods, generous tips, never a complaint. The kind of man who'd seen more than he'd ever say. The door chimed. Heads turned. A leather-clad figure strode in like a storm brewing. Jake "Thunder" Morrison, president of the Iron Wolves Motorcycle Club, wasn't just known, he was felt. 6'4", tattooed from neck to knuckles, and dripping with menace, Thunder scanned the room like a predator in a petting zoo. His eyes locked on Benny. "That's my seat, old man," Thunder growled. Benny looked up, calm, not confrontational. "Been sittin' here 20 years. Thunder slapped him. The blow landed hard. A wet crack, sharp and fast. Benny's head snapped sideways, glasses flying to the floor. A hush blanketed the room. Plates paused mid-air. Conversations died. Benny didn't stand. Didn't raise a hand. Just steadied his breath, picked up his bent glasses, and adjusted them with trembling fingers. His cheek burned, red and pulsing, but his eyes, they didn't waver. He took a sip of coffee. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating. Thunder grinned, wide and cruel. "Didn't think so." And with that, he sat across from Benny, claiming the booth like a throne. But in Benny's stillness, something stirred, an echo of battlefields, of commands barked over gunfire, of honor forged in the worst of humanity. He didn't need to fight to stand tall. Not yet. Benny's cheeks still throbbed, but his mind was somewhere far from Rosie's Café. Somewhere hotter, louder, crueler. The metallic taste of adrenaline mixed with the bitterness of coffee, and he didn't blink as Thunder mocked him. Because in Benny's mind, the sound of that slap had triggered more than a moment, it had triggered memory. He was 18 again, standing on a patch of cracked pavement outside the Army recruitment office in Richmond, Virginia, in the spring of 1972. He hadn't told his parents. His father had died the year before from a heart attack, and his mother, God bless her, never wanted him to see war. But Benny didn't join to spite her. He joined because something in his bones told him he had to go. The war was winding down, but not fast enough to spare the green recruits. He was shipped out 3 months later. Vietnam was a living inferno. Benny remembered the smell of rot and gasoline, the endless humidity that made every inch of clothing stick to your skin. He remembered Corporal Daniels, the first man he ever saw die. Daniels had taken a round to the throat while they were on patrol near Quang Tri. Benny had held the man's hand while his eyes dimmed. That moment had carved something into Benny that no metal could ever mend. Still, he pressed on. He became reliable, respected. He didn't rise quickly, but when he did, it stuck. By his second tour, he was a sergeant, then staff sergeant. By the time Vietnam ended, Benny had re-enlisted. He said it was to make the world safer. Truthfully, it was because he couldn't imagine being anyone else. Throughout the 80s and 90s, Benny served in posts around the world, Germany, Panama, Kuwait. He trained young recruits, taught them discipline and humility. He earned their trust. He was tough, but fair. He believed in the rules, but he also believed in the man behind the uniform. Then came Iraq. In 2004, he was embedded with a convoy near Fallujah when the IED detonated. He never heard the explosion, not in that moment. Just a white-hot wall of light and a pressure that collapsed his chest like a soda can. He woke up 3 days later in a medical unit with shrapnel in his leg and a tremor in his right hand that would never quite go away. That injury ended his active duty career, but not his identity. The army wasn't something you left, it was something you became. When he was medically retired at 50, he came back home to Virginia's Ridge, a place that had grown dusty and quiet, where kids still played in the park and folks still left their doors unlocked. He bought a modest 2-bedroom house on the edge of town and tried to settle into civilian life. But part of him never fully returned. It was Noah who grounded him. Noah was Benny's only child. His mother, Cynthia, had passed when Noah was just 12, an aggressive cancer that robbed her of years they all needed. Benny had taken leave during her illness, staying by her side until the end, holding Noah in his arms the night she slipped away. From that day forward, father and son became inseparable. Benny taught him how to shave, how to drive stick, how to respect people, and how to stand tall even when the world bent you low. Noah had always looked up to his father. At 17, he announced he was applying to West Point. Benny had hesitated. He'd seen what the military took from men, but he also knew what it gave them. Purpose. Brotherhood. Strength. So he helped Noah prepare, interviews, training, everything. Noah excelled. He became a model cadet and graduated with honors. His commissions took him to Afghanistan, then later Syria, and finally to NATO command in Brussels. But something shifted after his last tour in the Middle East. Benny saw it first in the way Noah sat too straight, as if bracing against something. Then in the silence. Long silences. Benny knew them well, those heavy, wordless moments that follow men home from war. They rarely talked about it directly. Benny never pried, and Noah never spilled. But there were nights when Benny would wake from a dream drenched in sweat and find Noah already sitting on the porch, staring into the trees. They'd sip coffee without a word, the quiet between them a language all its own. In the years that followed, Benny became known around town as a quiet but respected figure. He volunteered at the VFW Hall, spoke at the local high school on Veterans Day, and helped with training drills at the nearby Army Reserve Station. The café, Rosie's, became his haven. Every Tuesday morning, he sat in the corner booth with a paper and a mug, exchanging the occasional word with the staff but mostly keeping to himself. He didn't need attention. He just needed peace. That peace began to erode the day the Iron Wolves rolled into town. At first, it was a curiosity, 10 or 12 bikers with roaring engines and leather jackets, thundering down Main Street like something out of a western. People gave them space. They weren't overtly violent, but their presence was loud, aggressive. Thunder Morrison, their leader, was the worst of them, sharp-tongued, brutish, and territorial. They claimed Rosie's Café as their own by sheer force of intimidation. Every Tuesday, just after 10, Thunder would swagger in with 2 or 3 of his men and take the corner booth. If someone was sitting there, they were told to move, no excuses. Most complied. The staff, mostly younger women and 2 retired sisters who ran the place, didn't challenge them. Not out of agreement, but out of fear. Benny watched quietly at first. He would shift to another table. He didn't want trouble. But it burned. Not the insult, he was too old and too tempered to bruise easily. What bothered him was the surrender. The way the whole town seemed to shrink in the presence of swaggering cowards who mistook volume for strength. He'd seen real strength. It didn't shout. It didn't need to threaten. It endured. For months, Benny avoided the confrontation. But each week, he found it harder to look in the mirror afterward. It wasn't pride he missed, it was principle. And when Thunder slapped him that Tuesday morning, it wasn't just an act of violence. It was the last straw. Not because Benny wanted revenge. He didn't. But because something deep within him, something tied to decades of service and sacrifice, refused to let a bully believe he'd won. As Thunder smirked across the booth, Benny leaned back, collected himself, and reached for his phone. He didn't dial 911. He dialed Noah. Just 3 words, "Need you here." No explanation. No context. He knew his son would come. And when he did, things would never be the same again. Benny watched from the bench, feeling the familiar ache in his knees as he shifted. The pain was nothing, just a ghost from old injuries, but it reminded him that time was always ticking. Inside Rosie's cafe, Thunder still claimed the booth as if it were a throne. His boots were propped on the table now, dirty soles a silent insult. The town of Virginia's Ridge had changed. Benny remembered when Main Street was full of farmers and factory workers, when men nodded good morning without suspicion and women left pies on neighbors' porches just because. But the closure of the mill had left holes in both the economy and the spirit of the people. Those who could leave did. Those who stayed got older, quieter, more afraid. Then the iron wolves came. At first, they were just noise, 10 bikes tearing through quiet streets like thunderclaps. But the noise brought fear. They filled the vacuum left behind by authority too tired or too outnumbered to intervene. Sheriff Dale tried, but threats came to his home in the form of broken windows and burnt-out mailboxes. He knew the town couldn't afford a war. So he backed off. Benny saw what was happening long before it reached his booth. Every Tuesday, the ritual was the same. He arrived at 10, ordered black coffee, read the paper. Then Thunder would come in, sometimes alone, often with 2 or 3 others, and stare him down until he gave up the booth. Benny never spoke. Never argued. He just moved. At first, it felt like patience. After a few weeks, it felt like surrender. That morning's slap changed everything. Thunder hadn't just crossed a line, he'd erased it. And the worst part wasn't the sting. It was the silence. No one had moved. No one had spoken. Even Carly, the waitress, had paused in her pouring. It wasn't cowardice. It was a kind of trauma, when people grow so used to fear that they stop expecting protection. Benny couldn't let that become normal. He'd raised Noah to recognize that silence can be dangerous when it's mistaken for peace. He knew that lesson had taken root the day Noah chose West Point. And now, as Benny looked down Main Street and saw those 3 black SUVs pulling up, he knew his son had answered the call with more than just presence. He brought a message. The convoy parked. 12 soldiers emerged in crisp army service uniforms, coats buttoned, creases sharp, medals gleaming subtly under cloud-filtered light. They weren't here for war. They were here for witness. Noah stepped out last. Broad-shouldered and composed, he walked toward Benny. "Dad," he said softly, his voice steady but threaded with concern. "You okay?" Benny nodded once. "He's still inside." Noah's jaw tensed. He looked past the cafe windows, saw Thunder gesturing loudly at the counter. Then he turned to his men and gave a brief nod. They formed a straight line outside Rosie's, shoulder to shoulder, hands behind backs, expressions unreadable. Inside, the change was immediate. Thunder noticed the soldiers. His laugh paused. One of his men stood halfway, uncertain. The cafe, full of people who had shrunk into silence, began to stir. Whispers carried between tables. Then Noah walked in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't flash his badge or bark commands. He simply walked to the corner booth, looked at Thunder, and gestured to the seat across from him. "Mind if I sit?" Thunder smirked. "You his son?" "Yes." Thunder leaned back, feigning comfort. "This your way of scaring me? You brought a bunch of uniforms to stare at me?" Noah's voice was low, calm. "I brought them so the town wouldn't feel alone anymore." Thunder snorted. "Big talk." Noah didn't flinch. "You want people to fear you. But fear isn't the same as respect. My father has the ladder. You'll never earn it this way. The words hung heavy. Thunder glanced at the windows, then back at Noah. Noah stood slowly. It's not about revenge. It's about reminding people that some things, like dignity, don't get taken with a slap. He turned to leave. The soldiers outside stood still. Thunder didn't stop him. Not yet. Noah stepped out of the café with the same calm authority that had guided men through foreign battlefields. He didn't speak to the soldiers as he passed them, no commands, no signals. Their formation held, a wall of silent solidarity that stretched along the sidewalk. Inside Rosie's, the tension curdled into discomfort. Thunder no longer lounged. His boots were back on the floor. His fingers drummed on the table, rhythm offbeat, uncertain. Carly finally exhaled. She hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath since Noah entered. Martha Delaney, leaning on her cane behind the register, glanced toward the window where Benny sat on Cynthia's bench and whispered, "About time someone remembered who that man really is." The townspeople had always respected Benny. But over time, the quietness of his strength had made it easy to forget the weight he carried. To the young, he was just a quiet old guy in a faded army sweatshirt. To those who knew better, he was a decorated war hero who never talked about himself. And to Thunder Morrison, he had simply seemed like an easy target, until today. Noah's silent line of soldiers did more than intimidate. It rekindled something. The townsfolk, slowly and cautiously, began to peer out of their storefronts. The butcher, the pharmacist, the elderly woman from the quilt shop, they stepped to the sidewalk, curious but drawn. Not to the drama, but to the shift. Something was changing. Something overdue. Inside the café, Thunder stood. He looked around. His men, now 5 in number, all seemed unsure. One of them, a wiry kid named Mouse, barely out of his 20s, shifted in his seat and muttered, "Maybe we should bounce, man." Thunder glared at him, but it didn't land the way it used to. The fear was fraying. The door chimed again. But it wasn't Noah. It was Sheriff Dale. Gray-haired and paunchy, Dale didn't cut an intimidating figure. But he stepped inside with the calm of a man who no longer felt alone. He nodded at Martha and June, tipped his hat to Carly, and made his way to the center of the room. "Thunder," he said, voice steady, "I think it's time we had a talk." Thunder tried to reclaim his bluster. "Funny how you always show up after things get interesting." "Not funny at all," Dale replied. "Because I'm not alone anymore. You see those uniforms out there? That's what backing looks like. And I've got a town full of folks who are done being quiet." Thunder sneered. "This some kind of show?" "No," Dale said, "this is your cue." A beat passed. Thunder looked at the booth he'd taken, then at the people watching him. His charm, always shallow, evaporated entirely. He felt it now, not fear, but exposure. Like a thief caught not by sirens, but by the gaze of every person he'd ever tried to diminish. He grabbed his vest and turned toward the door. But as he reached it, he paused. Benny hadn't moved from the bench outside. His eyes, calm as still water, met Thunder's through the glass. Thunder hesitated, then walked out slowly, boots hitting the pavement like reluctant confessions. Noah, now standing beside his father, didn't move to intercept him. Thunder stopped just a few feet away. For a long moment, the two men faced each other, one towering and leather-bound, the other weathered, seated, eyes steady beneath steel-gray hair. Then Thunder spoke. "You called your boy to fight your battles?" Benny's voice, soft but sharp, cut through the warm July air. "No. I called my son to witness." Thunder scoffed, but it lacked heat. "You think this changes anything?" "It already has," Benny said. Behind them, the café door opened again, and a voice called out, "Carly," holding a tray of coffee with hands no longer shaking. "Mr. Bennett, your table's open. Fresh pots on." Thunder turned, realizing what had just happened. The café, the booth, had returned to its rightful owner. And not through violence or threats, but through the resilience of one man's quiet defiance and a community that had finally decided to remember its spine. Thunder said nothing more. He turned and walked off down the street, his men trailing awkwardly behind him. Noah helped Benny to his feet. "You want to press charges?" Benny shook his head. "No. The law didn't need to break him. The truth did." They walked back inside together. The soldiers remained at attention until Noah gave a simple nod, and then they dispersed. No words, no salute. Just silent guardians fading into the town like they'd always belonged there. When Benny sat down in his booth, the café exhaled. Conversations resumed. Someone turned on the radio. June brought him a slice of apple pie without asking. Across the street, something unexpected began to happen. One by one, people who had stayed inside during the confrontation came forward. Old men from the VFW post. Retired teachers. A mechanic who'd once been a Marine. They didn't speak, but they stood near the café, some on the sidewalk, some leaning on their canes or standing with arms crossed. They were watching. Not Thunder. Benny. Noah took the seat across from his father and poured them both coffee. "You really would have sat there every Tuesday for the rest of your life, wouldn't you?" Benny smirked. "I would've. But it's good to share the view." Outside, the Iron Wolves didn't return. Not that day, not that week. Word spread fast. Other towns heard the story, how a veteran held his ground without raising a fist, how a son arrived not with violence but with dignity, how a whole town woke up from a long sleep. Sheriff Dale started making regular stops at Rosie's again, not to check for trouble, but just to talk. To be present. A few days later, he hosted a town meeting about civic pride and community protection. It was the first standing room-only meeting in years. Something had shifted. And in the quiet after that storm, Benny returned each Tuesday to his booth. The paper still arrived, the coffee still steamed, but now there were extras, veterans he hadn't seen in years. Young recruits from the reserve unit. Even some high schoolers who just wanted to listen. They called it the corner post. Noah showed up when he could. Sometimes with his uniform. Sometimes not. But always with respect. Always with reverence for the man who had taught him that stillness was never weakness, and that there were battles best won by standing your ground, not raising your voice. The following Tuesday came with a gentle breeze and a sky so clear it felt like the town had been freshly scrubbed. Rosie's Café opened promptly at 7 a.m., as it had for the last 40 years, but something felt different. More chairs were set near Benny's booth. Martha and June had even cleared out one of the old coat racks to make space. Benny arrived at precisely 9:45. He always liked to get there early enough to have a few minutes alone before the small crowd began filtering in. He wore his army sweatshirt again, but today it was clean, the fabric pressed and the cuffs neatly rolled. His gait, while slower than it used to be, had purpose. The red slap mark was gone, replaced by a faint bruise that now told a much larger story. One of resistance. One of return. As Benny stepped into the café, the bell chimed, and the room fell into a brief hush, not out of discomfort, but out of respect. Every person looked his way, and this time, they didn't look through him. They saw him. Carly greeted him first. "Morning, Mr. Bennett. Table's ready." He gave her a gentle nod and smiled. "Thank you, Carly." She leaned in closer, voice lowered. "We've all been talking about what you did. What you stood for. Some of us forgot we could push back. Thank you." Benny offered a quiet, "Wasn't just me," and walked to his booth. He placed the folded newspaper on the table, set down his glasses, and took a slow sip of the freshly brewed coffee already waiting for him. Then came the others. One by one, veterans began arriving. First was Calvin Reese, a Vietnam-era Marine who hadn't been to Rosie's in over a year. Then came Rachel Castillo, former Army medic, now a school nurse. She carried a thermos and a small American flag pin she placed gently on the edge of Benny's table. Within 30 minutes, the booth had become surrounded by chairs, wheelchairs, crutches, and stories. They didn't talk about war directly, not at first. They talked about Benny's stand. How he had not shouted, not fought, not cursed. How he had remained. That kind of strength resonated far beyond the slap, beyond Thunder's swagger, and even beyond Noah's uniformed presence. It reminded them all of something they'd known but nearly forgotten. Courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it just doesn't move. Outside, more people began to gather, teachers, parents, teenagers. The story had spread like wildfire through town and surrounding counties. Even the local news had caught wind of it. A modest white van from Channel 6 pulled up just before noon. A young reporter named Laura Fields approached cautiously with a cameraman. "Mr. Bennett," she asked. "We're hoping to speak with you about last week's incident. We'd like to hear it from your perspective." Benny shook his head politely. "Not much to say. A man tried to take something that wasn't his, and I decided not to let him." Laura blinked. "You didn't fight back. That's what's surprising to so many." "I fought plenty in my life," Benny said, sipping his coffee. "Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is not return the blow." She seemed stunned by the simplicity. "Do you think Thunder will come back?" Benny looked toward the window, then back at her. "Maybe. Bullies usually do. But I'll be here either way." That evening, the interview ran on the 6 o'clock news. They aired it without dramatic music, without spin. Just Benny's voice over footage of Rosie's Café and the quiet gathering of townsfolk surrounding him. They called it, "The Stand at Rosie's." It struck a nerve, and not just locally. Across the state, veterans organizations began sharing the story. One group from Richmond sent Benny a commemorative plaque, "For Valor Beyond the Battlefield." Letters began arriving, handwritten ones from people who'd never met Benny but felt like they knew him. One came from a Gold Star mother who wrote, "Your stillness gave me peace. My son would have respected that." The cafe transformed in small but powerful ways. Martha and June added a corkboard labeled "Veterans Wall." Locals tacked on old photographs, service medals, dog tags. A carpenter offered to replace the old booth table with a handmade oak one. Benny declined, saying, "The scratches tell part of the story." Noah came back the following week in civilian clothes, sitting across from his father with a rare softness in his eyes. "They're asking me to speak about this at the base," he said between sips of coffee. "Want me to?" "If you believe in what it means," Benny replied. "Not just because I'm your father." "I do," Noah said. Then he added, "Some of the younger guys asked how you managed to stay so calm. I told them it's because you never stopped being a soldier. You just changed your battlefield." Benny chuckled. "We all change battlefields. Some just don't realize it." In the weeks that followed, things shifted permanently. The Iron Wolves still existed, but their influence in Virginia's Ridge crumbled. Thunder hadn't been seen in town since that day. Sheriff Dale, empowered by the town's awakening, began enforcing ordinances more strictly. He reconnected with nearby counties to form a cooperative patrol route. The Iron Wolves were pushed farther into the periphery, their myth deflated. One morning, Benny received a formal envelope from the Department of Veterans Affairs. Inside was an invitation. He was to be honored at the state capitol during a special ceremony titled Veterans of Honor, Heroes at Home. Benny nearly discarded it. He wasn't a man of ceremonies. But Noah called the same day. "You going?" he asked. Not sure yet. I think you should, Noah said. Not for the applause. For the record. So they know this story. After a long pause, Benny said, then I will. For the record. The ceremony came a month later. Held under a wide blue sky on the Capitol steps, Benny stood beside 5 other veterans as each was recognized. The governor shook his hand, and a brief version of his stand at Rosie's Café was shared with the gathered crowd. But Benny didn't speak that day. Instead, he listened. Listened to the stories of others. Listened to the quiet clapping that meant more than any medal ever could. And when it was done, he returned home the same way he had left, quietly, without spectacle, with only Noah by his side. That following Tuesday, Rosie's Café was full again. Veterans, students, shopkeepers, and even passing travelers who had heard about the booth. Some just stopped in for coffee and left with a picture near the table. Others stayed to talk, to learn. Benny welcomed them all. Because this was never about fame. It was about reminding people that dignity doesn't demand a spotlight, it commands a seat. Fall settled into Virginia's ridge like an old friend, crisp and familiar. The leaves turned brilliant orange and gold, fluttering down onto cracked sidewalks and the hoods of parked trucks. At Rosie's Café, the bell above the door chimed steadily as more people began making Benny's booth a regular stop, though no one ever sat in his seat unless invited. It had become an unspoken town rule, a kind of sacred respect. The corner post, as folks now called it, remained Benny's. Noah arrived early that Tuesday morning, dressed in civilian clothes and carrying a fresh box of donated books from the nearby Reserve Center. He set them down near the veterans' wall, which had grown considerably. Now, alongside faded photographs and medals, were thank you letters, dog tags from family members who had served, and even crayon drawings from local schoolchildren who had been told, "This is the booth where courage sits." "Morning, Dad," Noah said as he slid into the booth across from Benny. "Morning, son," Benny replied, folding his newspaper. "How's command?" "Busy," Noah sighed. "But the right kind of busy. They asked me to lead a new program, something for transitioning soldiers. Helping them re-enter civilian life." Benny raised a brow. "That sounds like work that matters." "It is," Noah nodded. "It came out of what happened here. They saw what a town rallying behind a veteran could mean. And they want to model it." Benny didn't reply right away. He looked around the cafe instead. It was fuller than ever, nearly all the tables taken. Calvin Reese was joking with a young reservist near the jukebox. Rachel Castillo sat at a window seat, sipping coffee and quietly mentoring a high school girl who'd lost her father overseas. The sense of purpose in the room was thick. It didn't speak loudly, but it was present. "It's a good idea," Benny finally said. "We need to teach them how to carry the weight without letting it break them." Noah smiled. "That's what you've always done." Benny chuckled. "I've just had more time to get used to it." Outside, the street had also begun to change. A new sign hung just beyond Rosie's, Veteran Square. It had been Dale's idea, and the town council had approved it unanimously. They'd renamed the small intersection where Main Street curved near the cafe. It wasn't just a nod to Benny, but to every man and woman who had served and returned, many of whom now came from surrounding towns to spend a morning there. Even the sheriff seemed different now. Dale, once weary and resigned, had become a figure of local leadership again. He'd organized town safety workshops, increased patrols, and reinstated community meetings. He made a point to visit the cafe every week, sometimes staying for a slice of June's famous peach cobbler. That morning, as Benny poured another cup of coffee, Dale entered with a man in a blazer, someone unfamiliar. "Morning, Ben." "Noah," Dale greeted. "Morning, Sheriff," Benny replied. "This here's Carl Jensen," Dale said. "He's from the State Veterans Board. Heard about what you did." Brought something for you. Carl reached into his briefcase and pulled out a framed certificate. It's not much, he said, but we're renaming the annual State Veteran Summit keynote in your honor. Starting next year, it'll be called the Bennett Address. Given by someone who exemplifies service, honor, and community strength. Benny blinked slowly. That's quite the gesture. You earned it, Carl said. Not just because you served. But because you reminded everyone what that service means. As they spoke, a teenage boy approached the booth. His hands trembled slightly as he stood beside Benny. Mr. Bennett, the boy asked. I'm Mark. My dad served. He died in Afghanistan. I never really knew him, but my mom said he was like you. I just wanted to say thanks. Benny reached out, steady and warm, placing a hand on the boy's shoulder. He was a hero. So are you, for carrying on. The boy nodded, eyes misting, and returned to his mother at the counter. Noah leaned forward. You still think you're just a man in a booth? I'm still a man in a booth, Benny said. But the view's gotten better. Outside, a few motorcycles rumbled down the far end of Main Street. Not the Iron Wolves, those days had passed, but a new group, the Blue Valor Riders, a club of veterans who rode to raise money for wounded warriors. They parked along the curb and entered Rosie's with respectful nods. Later that day, a small ceremony was held at the new Veterans Square sign. Dozens showed up, including reporters, students, clergy, and soldiers. Noah gave a short speech about quiet heroism and the enduring strength of those who served, but he kept it centered on the town. On Rosie's. On the idea that sometimes the strongest voice is the one that doesn't shout. Benny was asked to speak but declined. Instead, he simply stood beside the sign, shook hands, and smiled. As the ceremony wound down and people returned to their lives, Benny and Noah remained seated on Cynthia's bench. A crisp wind passed through the trees. Ever wonder what she'd say if she could see all this? Noah asked. Benny didn't answer right away. He looked out at the street, at the storefronts newly painted, the café full, the flag fluttering above the post office. She'd say, Benny murmured, it's about time you stopped hiding and let people see who you really are. Noah chuckled. Yeah. That sounds like her. They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, Noah asked, what now? Benny gave a small shrug. We keep showing up. Tuesdays. Same booth. Same coffee. Maybe share the corner if someone new wants a seat. Noah nodded. And if thunder ever comes back? Benny smiled softly. Then we'll remind him, again, that you don't need noise to be strong. Just presence. Just patience. The sky began to dim with the early colors of evening. Back inside the cafe, Martha Delaney had taped a new sign to the edge of Benny's booth. Just 5 words. Respect is earned right here. The words weren't flashy. Weren't loud. But they spoke volumes. Honor endures.